Standing in Conference Room B at Hartwell Industries, I watched Vice President Sandra Walsh announce to 12 department heads that my consulting methods were outdated and no longer aligned with their progressive vision. Sandra introduced Brad Coleman, a flashy consultant from Silicon Valley, as my replacement for the crucial Morrison Manufacturing merger negotiation. This deal was worth $87 million, and I had spent 8 months preparing for it. The room fell silent as Sandra dismissed my expertise in front of everyone, calling me dispensable and requesting I hand over my files immediately. The fluorescent lights in that conference room seemed harsher than usual as I processed what had just happened. 6 years of dedicated service to Hartwell Industries. 6 years of building their entire strategic consulting division from absolutely nothing. And this was how it ended. I kept my expression neutral while my mind raced through the implications of Sandra's announcement. My background wasn't typical for most consultants. Before joining Hartwell, I had worked as a corporate lawyer for 8 years, specializing in merger and acquisition negotiations. That legal foundation gave me a unique perspective that most business consultants lacked. I understood not just the financial and strategic elements of deals, but also the psychological and legal nuances that could make or break complex negotiations. When I first arrived at Hartwell, their consulting division was practically non-existent. They had a few junior analysts who could crunch numbers, but no one with the expertise to guide major corporate negotiations. I developed a comprehensive approach that combined traditional legal analysis with psychological profiling of negotiation counterparts. This method had proven incredibly effective over the years. The Morrison Manufacturing deal was supposed to be my crowning achievement. I had spent the last 8 months not just analyzing financial statements and market conditions, but also studying Marcus Thompson Morrison's chief executive officer. I researched his background, his previous negotiations, his communication style, and his decision-making patterns. Most importantly, I had identified his core values and motivational drivers information that would be crucial in structuring a successful deal. Brad Coleman stood near the whiteboard, smugly flipping through my preliminary files. His confidence was palpable, but I could see he was only skimming the surface-level information. He wore an expensive suit that screamed Silicon Valley startup culture, complete with trendy sneakers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His hair was perfectly styled, and he had the kind of practiced charm that worked well in boardrooms filled with younger executives. Sandra beamed with satisfaction as she explained Brad's qualifications. He had apparently revolutionized 3 different tech company negotiations in the past 2 years, bringing what she called a modern digital approach to traditional business deals. She emphasized repeatedly that his methods represented the future of corporate consulting, while mine were relics of an outdated era. The other executives in the room looked uncomfortable. Tom Rodriguez, our chief financial officer, kept glancing at me with what appeared to be sympathy mixed with frustration. He had always supported my work and had been instrumental in securing approval for several of my previous deals. Amy Chen, one of the junior analysts who worked closely with me, looked genuinely shocked. Her mouth was slightly open, and she kept shaking her head almost imperceptibly. I gathered my materials with deliberate calm, maintaining the professional composure that had served me well throughout my career. My personal notebook filled with insights about Marcus Thompson that had taken months to develop went into my briefcase along with my encrypted laptop. These items contained the real strategy for the Morrison deal, the psychological profile and negotiation approach that could make the difference between success and failure. The files I left behind contained only the basic financial analysis, market research, and standard due diligence materials. Anyone could access that information with enough time and resources. What they couldn't replicate was my understanding of Thompson's personality, his negotiation style, and the specific approach needed to earn his trust and respect. Sandra's voice took on a condescending tone as she wished me luck in my future endeavors. She suggested that perhaps I might find opportunities at smaller firms that still valued traditional approaches. Brad nodded along, adding that he looked forward to bringing fresh energy to what had clearly become a stagnant situation. I responded with grace, thanking Sandra for the opportunities Hartwell had provided, and expressing confidence that Brad would bring his own unique perspective to the Morrison negotiations. I even managed a genuine smile as I shook hands with several colleagues who had worked with me over the years. The walk to the elevator felt longer than usual. Each step echoed in the hallway, and I could sense curious glances from employees who had witnessed the conference room drama. My reputation at Hartwell had been built on consistent results and professional integrity. 14 major deals successfully closed, saving the company over $200 million in the process. Yet none of that seemed to matter when Sandra decided she wanted someone newer and more fashionable. As the elevator doors closed, I felt an unexpected sense of relief wash over me. The toxic environment that had developed under Sandra's leadership was something I had been tolerating rather than enjoying. Her tendency to take credit for successful deals while blaming others for any setbacks had created a culture of fear and resentment among the consulting team. My phone buzzed just as I reached the parking garage. The caller identification showed a name I hadn't seen in months. Jessica Martinez, my former law school roommate who now worked as head of legal affairs at Morrison Manufacturing. We had kept in touch sporadically over the years, exchanging holiday cards and occasional professional updates. Jessica's voice sounded urgent when I answered. She explained that Marcus Thompson had specifically requested me for the Hartwell negotiations after researching their consulting team. He had been impressed by my track record and wanted to work with someone who understood both the legal and business aspects of complex deals. Jessica wanted to give me a heads up that Thompson was expecting to meet with me personally, not some random replacement. This information hit me like a lightning bolt. Sandra had made her decision without considering that the client might have preferences about who handled their account. Thompson's specific request for me meant that Brad would be walking into a situation where he wasn't just unknown, but potentially unwanted. I thanked Jessica for the warning and promised to keep her updated on any developments. As I drove home that evening, I began to realize that Sandra might have made a much bigger mistake than either of us initially understood. The psychological profile I had developed of Marcus Thompson painted a picture of a traditional businessman who valued relationships, consistency, and proven expertise over flashy presentations and trendy approaches. He had built Morrison Manufacturing through careful, methodical decision-making and preferred to work with consultants who demonstrated similar qualities. Brad Coleman represented everything that would likely irritate Thompson. His Silicon Valley swagger, his emphasis on disruption and innovation over stability, and his lack of experience with traditional manufacturing companies would probably create immediate friction. That night, I updated my resume and began reaching out to my professional network. If Sandra thought I was dispensable, she was about to learn exactly how valuable I really was to both Hartwell and their clients. 2 days after my unceremonious departure from the Morrison account, my phone started ringing with calls from colleagues still at Hartwell. The preliminary meeting with Morrison Manufacturing had been according to Amy Chen, who called me first an absolute disaster. Amy's voice was hushed, clearly trying to avoid being overheard in the office. She described how Brad had approached the negotiation like he was pitching to venture capitalists in Palo Alto. He brought elaborate slide presentations filled with buzzwords about synergistic optimization, disruptive integration strategies, and leveraging digital transformation to maximize stakeholder value creation. Marcus Thompson, she reported, had sat through about 15 minutes of Brad's presentation before his expression shifted from polite interest to barely concealed irritation. Thompson was a man who had built his manufacturing empire through decades of hands-on experience, practical decision-making, and straightforward business relationships. He appreciated substance over style and results over rhetoric. The meeting had gone downhill rapidly when Brad suggested that Morrison Manufacturing needed to embrace a more agile mindset and consider pivoting their core business model to align with emerging market paradigms. Thompson had apparently interrupted at that point, asking Brad if he understood anything about the manufacturing industry or Morrison's actual business operations. Brad's response, according to Amy, had been to launch into another presentation about how his previous clients in the tech sector had achieved remarkable growth through strategic reinvention. He seemed completely oblivious to the fact that Thompson was asking a genuine question about his qualifications and industry knowledge. The final straw came when Brad suggested that the merger negotiation process itself needed to be disrupted through innovative collaborative frameworks and real-time decision optimization protocols. Thompson had stood up, gathered his materials, and announced that there appeared to be a fundamental misalignment in values and approach between the two companies. Rachel Murphy Morrison's vice president of operations, who had accompanied Thompson to the meeting, later called Hartwell to express concern about the direction of the negotiations. She questioned whether Hartwell truly understood Morrison's business culture and objectives. Tom Rodriguez called me next, his frustration evident in every word. As chief financial officer, he understood the financial implications of losing the Morrison deal, and he was watching Sandra scramble to contain the damage from her decision. Sandra had immediately called an emergency meeting with the consulting team, but instead of acknowledging her error in judgment, she had demanded that Brad fix the situation immediately. Tom described the emergency meeting as chaotic and unproductive. Sandra had berated Brad for his presentation style, telling him he needed to be more conservative and traditional in his approach. Brad had defended his methods, arguing that Morrison simply needed time to understand the value of his innovative strategies. The two of them had argued for nearly an hour while other team members sat in uncomfortable silence. Meanwhile, I was discovering that word of my availability had spread quickly through my professional network. 3 different companies had reached out within 48 hours of my departure from Hartwell, each expressing interest in my consulting services. Phoenix Capital Group, a growing investment firm, had made a particularly attractive offer for me to lead their new strategic advisory division. The irony wasn't lost on me that my forced departure from Hartwell was opening doors I hadn't even known existed. Phoenix Capital had been watching my work from afar and saw my sudden availability as an opportunity to expand their consulting capabilities. They offered not just competitive compensation, but also the chance to build a consulting practice from the ground up with complete autonomy over methodology and client selection. Amy called again the following afternoon with more disturbing news from inside Hartwell. Sandra had hired 2 additional external consultants to support Brad's efforts with Morrison, spending nearly $50,000 in emergency consulting fees to try to salvage the relationship. These consultants were impressive on paper, but they had no history with the Morrison account and no understanding of Thompson's personality or preferences. The situation became even more complicated when Thompson's assistant called Hartwell directly asking to speak specifically with me about rescheduling the next negotiation session. When the receptionist explained that I no longer worked on the Morrison account, the assistant asked for clarification about my role in the project. This inquiry eventually reached Sandra's desk, and she found herself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to Morrison Manufacturing that she had replaced their specifically requested consultant with someone they had never met or approved. Thompson's reaction, according to Rachel Murphy, was immediate and negative. Thompson demanded a phone conference with Sandra to discuss what he perceived as a breach of trust and professional commitment. During that call, which Tom Rodriguez was asked to join for damage control, Thompson expressed serious concerns about Hartwell's decision-making process and their commitment to the merger negotiations. Sandra had apparently tried to frame my departure as a mutual decision based on scheduling conflicts and strategic realignment of responsibilities. Thompson wasn't buying that explanation, especially when he learned that Brad had no previous experience with manufacturing industry negotiations. The call ended with Thompson saying he needed time to reconsider whether Hartwell was the right consulting partner for Morrison's needs. He gave Sandra 48 hours to provide a detailed explanation of how the consulting team change would benefit Morrison's interests. Tom privately reached out to me that evening expressing his regret about the entire situation. He admitted that several executives had questioned Sandra's decision from the beginning, but she had insisted that bringing in fresh talent was necessary for the company's evolution. Now, with the Morrison deal in jeopardy, those same executives were asking harder questions about Sandra's leadership and judgment. The psychological profile I had developed of Thompson was proving accurate in ways that brought me no satisfaction. He was exactly the kind of businessman who viewed consultant changes mid-project as a red flag about organizational stability and competence. His manufacturing background had taught him to value consistency, reliability, and proven expertise over innovation for its own sake. Brad's approach was the antithesis of everything Thompson respected in business relationships. While Brad's methods might work well with tech startups looking to disrupt markets, they were completely inappropriate for a traditional manufacturing company seeking a stable strategic partnership through a complex merger process. As I prepared for my first meeting with Phoenix Capital Group, I couldn't help but feel that Sandra's attempt to replace me was about to cost Hartwell much more than they had anticipated. The Morrison deal represented not just immediate revenue, but also a strategic relationship that could lead to additional opportunities in the manufacturing sector. Thompson's threat to withdraw from negotiations entirely wasn't an empty gesture. Morrison Manufacturing had other options for strategic partnerships, and they weren't dependent on Hartwell for their growth plans. If Thompson concluded that Hartwell couldn't provide competent, stable consulting support, he would simply move on to other opportunities. The irony was that Sandra's desire to appear innovative and forward-thinking was actually making Hartwell look unprofessional and unreliable to one of their most important potential clients. The phone call from Tom Rodriguez came at 7:30 in the morning, 3 days after the Morrison meeting disaster. His voice carried a level of stress I had never heard from him during our 6 years working together. Sandra had discovered Marcus Thompson's explicit demand for me to return to the negotiations, and the magnitude of her error was finally becoming clear to everyone at Hartwell. The company's stock price had dropped 4% overnight as news about the troubled Morrison deal leaked to industry analysts. Financial reporters were asking questions about Hartwell's consulting capabilities and organizational stability. The board of directors, who rarely involved themselves in day-to-day operations, were suddenly requesting detailed explanations about personnel decisions and project management protocols. Tom explained that Sandra was facing direct pressure from Richard Hartwell himself, the company's founder and chief executive officer. Richard had built the company over 25 years and prided himself on maintaining excellent client relationships. The prospect of losing a major deal due to internal consultant changes was exactly the kind of operational failure that could trigger significant corporate restructuring. Sandra's initial response to the crisis was to throw money and resources at the problem. She authorized Brad to bring in a team of 4 additional consultants from his previous firm, each billing at premium hourly rates. She also approved expenses for a complete reanalysis of the Morrison deal, essentially paying to recreate work I had already completed months earlier. The fundamental issue, however, wasn't about resources or expertise. Marcus Thompson had lost confidence in Hartwell's competence and reliability. No amount of additional consulting support could rebuild the trust that Sandra's decision had destroyed. Amy Chen provided inside details about the increasingly chaotic atmosphere at Hartwell. Sandra had become volatile and unpredictable, calling emergency meetings at random hours and demanding immediate solutions to problems that required time and careful consideration. Brad was growing defensive under the pressure, insisting that his approach was fundamentally sound and that Morrison simply needed to embrace more progressive thinking. The consulting team was caught in the middle of this dysfunction, trying to maintain professional standards while their leaders engaged in increasingly desperate damage control efforts. Several team members had privately expressed interest in leaving Hartwell if the situation didn't improve quickly. Meanwhile, my transition to Phoenix Capital Group was proceeding smoothly. My new colleagues were impressed with my background and eager to leverage my expertise for their expanding client base. The work environment was collaborative and supportive, a refreshing contrast to the toxic atmosphere that had developed under Sandra's leadership at Hartwell. Phoenix Capital offered me complete autonomy in developing consulting methodologies and selecting clients. They understood that my value came from my unique combination of legal expertise and business acumen, and they wanted to build a consulting division around those strengths rather than trying to force me into some predetermined mold. 3 other companies had also approached me about consulting contracts, word having spread quickly through professional networks about my availability. The demand for my services was validating after Sandra's dismissive treatment, but it also highlighted how short-sighted her decision had been from a business perspective. Rachel Murphy from Morrison Manufacturing called me directly on Thursday afternoon. She explained that Marcus Thompson was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress and the apparent confusion within Hartwell's consulting team. Thompson was particularly annoyed that nobody seemed to understand his company's culture values or strategic objectives. Rachel asked if I would be willing to discuss the situation informally, emphasizing that Thompson still respected my expertise and would value my perspective on how to move forward. This conversation was technically appropriate since I was no longer employed by Hartwell, but it represented a significant development in the evolving relationship dynamics. During our discussion, Rachel revealed several important details about Thompson's thinking. He viewed the consultant change as evidence of deeper organizational problems at Hartwell. His experience in manufacturing had taught him that companies with strong leadership don't make arbitrary personnel changes in the middle of critical projects. Thompson was also concerned about Brad's apparent lack of industry knowledge and his inappropriate approach to traditional manufacturing businesses. Rachel mentioned that Thompson had described Brad's presentation as sounding like someone trying to sell smartphone apps to steel mill operators. Most significantly, Rachel indicated that Thompson was actively exploring alternative consulting arrangements that might allow the Morrison deal to move forward without Hartwell's involvement. This development represented Sandra's worst nightmare, losing not just the consulting fees, but also being cut out of the deal entirely. That evening, Tom Rodriguez called with news that Richard Hartwell had personally intervened in the crisis. Richard had called Thompson directly to apologize for the confusion and to explore options for salvaging the relationship. However, Thompson's response had been diplomatically negative, expressing appreciation for Richard's call while maintaining that Morrison needed to evaluate all available options. Sandra's desperation reached new heights when she began making personal appeals to former colleagues and industry contacts, trying to gather intelligence about Thompson's intentions and exploring back-channel approaches to rebuilding the relationship. These efforts only reinforced Thompson's perception that Hartwell was organizationally unstable and unprofessional. The consulting team's morale continued to deteriorate as Sandra's behavior became increasingly erratic. She was blaming everyone except herself for the Morrison situation, creating a culture of fear and defensive positioning that made effective collaboration impossible. Brad's position was becoming untenable as well. His confidence was eroding under the constant criticism and pressure to produce results that his methods couldn't deliver. He began suggesting increasingly desperate strategies, including proposals to restructure the entire deal framework to better align with his consulting approach. During a heated board meeting that lasted 4 hours, Richard Hartwell received a formal complaint from Marcus Thompson about unprofessional conduct and breach of expectations. Thompson's legal team had drafted a letter outlining Morrison's damages from the delayed and mismanaged negotiations, potentially setting the stage for a lawsuit worth millions of dollars. The board members who had previously trusted Sandra's judgment about consulting team management were now questioning her competence and decision-making abilities. Several directors privately expressed concern that Sandra's personnel decisions were putting the company at legal and financial risk. As I settled into my new office at Phoenix Capital Group, I couldn't help but reflect on the escalating consequences of Sandra's snap decision to replace me. What had started as a routine personnel change was now threatening Hartwell's reputation, financial stability, and long-term client relationships. The psychological profile I had developed of Marcus Thompson continued to prove accurate. He was exactly the kind of executive who would view organizational chaos and poor judgment as disqualifying factors in business partnerships. His patience with Hartwell's dysfunction was rapidly running out, and Sandra's desperate attempts to fix the situation were only making things worse. Friday evening at 6:45, my apartment doorbell rang unexpectedly. I wasn't expecting any visitors, and the timing seemed unusual for delivery services or routine visits. When I looked through the peephole, I was shocked to see Sandra Walsh standing in my hallway, her expression tense and agitated. Opening the door cautiously, I was immediately struck by Sandra's disheveled appearance. Her usually immaculate professional attire was wrinkled. Her hair was slightly messed, and her eyes showed the strain of several sleepless nights. This was not the composed, confident executive who had dismissed me so casually just a week earlier. Sandra pushed past me into my living room without invitation, her voice sharp and demanding as she instructed me to fix the mess I had created with the Morrison account. Her logic was startling. Somehow my professional departure from Hartwell had caused the negotiation problems rather than her decision to replace me with an inappropriate consultant. I remained calm and pointed out that I hadn't created any mess at all. The Morrison situation was entirely the result of her choice to remove me from an account where the client had specifically requested my involvement. My tone was professional but firm, refusing to accept responsibility for consequences that flowed directly from her decisions. Sandra's demeanor shifted from demanding to openly hostile as she realized I wasn't going to be intimidated or manipulated into cleaning up her mistakes. She began making thinly veiled threats about my reputation in the consulting industry, suggesting that she had enough influence to make my career very difficult if I didn't cooperate with her demands. I quietly activated the recording function on my smartphone, keeping the device discreetly positioned while maintaining eye contact with Sandra. Her increasingly aggressive behavior was creating a potentially valuable record of her unprofessional conduct and threatening statements. The conversation became more revealing as Sandra's desperation overrode her usual political caution. She admitted that the board of directors was seriously considering her termination if the Morrison situation couldn't be resolved quickly. The potential lawsuit and damaged client relationships had created a crisis that threatened her entire career at Hartwell. Sandra revealed that the company could face not just the loss of the Morrison contract, but also a $50 million lawsuit for breach of professional commitments and negligent consulting services. Morrison's legal team had documented the time and resources wasted due to Hartwell's consultant changes and inadequate project management. In a moment of complete desperation, Sandra offered me my old position back with a 20% salary increase and a promotion to senior consulting director. She promised complete autonomy over the Morrison account and guaranteed that Brad would be removed from any involvement in the negotiations. My response was professionally polite, but definitively negative. I explained that I had moved on to better opportunities at Phoenix Capital Group, where I was building a consulting practice with full support and respect from leadership. The toxic environment at Hartwell was something I had no interest in returning to, regardless of the financial incentives offered. I mentioned that my new position offered not just better compensation, but also the professional respect and organizational stability that had been lacking under her leadership. Phoenix Capital valued my expertise and gave me the autonomy to develop consulting methodologies without arbitrary interference or personnel changes. Sandra's face showed a mixture of rage and panic as she realized I held all the leverage in this situation. She had destroyed her own negotiating position through poor decision-making and unprofessional behavior, and now she was completely dependent on my goodwill for any chance of salvaging the Morrison relationship. At this point, I casually mentioned that I had been in contact with Marcus Thompson's team about potential consulting arrangements. Thompson's assistant had called me directly to discuss the possibility of working with Morrison Manufacturing on future projects independent of any relationship with Hartwell. The revelation that Morrison Manufacturing had approached me directly hit Sandra like a physical blow. She realized that not only had she lost a valuable consultant, but that consultant was now positioned to work directly with the client she was desperately trying to retain. I explained that Thompson's team had expressed interest in my expertise and experience with complex manufacturing negotiations. They appreciated my understanding of their industry and business culture qualities that had apparently been lacking in their recent interactions with Hartwell's replacement consulting team. Sandra's desperation reached new heights as she understood the full implications of the situation. Morrison could potentially cut Hartwell out of future negotiations entirely by working directly with me through Phoenix Capital Group. This development would transform the current crisis from a damaged relationship into a complete business catastrophe. Amy Chen called during Sandra's visit, reporting that Brad Coleman had been caught fabricating progress reports about the Morrison negotiations. He had been telling Sandra that the relationship was improving when in fact Thompson hadn't returned any of his phone calls for 3 days straight. Tom Rodriguez also reached out with warnings about Sandra's increasingly erratic behavior at the office. He mentioned that Sandra had been privately blaming me for sabotaging the Morrison deal, despite the obvious fact that her own decisions had created the entire problem. The most damaging revelation came when Sandra, in her frustrated state, sent an email to the entire executive team claiming that I had deliberately undermined the Morrison negotiations before leaving Hartwell. This email was forwarded to me by a sympathetic colleague within minutes of being sent. Reading Sandra's email, I realized she had made a critical error that could have serious legal consequences for both her personally and for Hartwell as a company. Her written claims about my alleged sabotage constituted clear defamation, providing me with documented evidence of malicious and false statements designed to damage my professional reputation. I informed Sandra that I had received a copy of her defamatory email and would be consulting with my attorney about appropriate legal responses. Her face went pale as she realized that her desperate attempt to shift blame had actually created additional legal exposure for herself and her employer. The conversation ended with Sandra's grudging recognition that her position was hopeless. She had alienated the client, damaged her own credibility, created legal liability, and pushed away the one person who might have been able to salvage the situation. Her threats and demands had accomplished nothing except to make her situation even worse. As Sandra left my apartment, I reflected on how completely the power dynamics had shifted in just 1 week. Her attempt to demonstrate authority by replacing me had backfired spectacularly, leaving her desperate and vulnerable while elevating my market value and professional opportunities. The recording of our conversation combined with her defamatory email provided strong evidence of her unprofessional conduct and poor judgment. These materials would be valuable if legal action became necessary, but they also demonstrated the toxic leadership style that had made Hartwell an unpleasant place to work. Sandra's visit had actually strengthened my resolve to move forward with new opportunities rather than looking backward at the dysfunction she had created. Her hostile approach and threatening behavior confirmed that leaving Hartwell had been the right decision for both professional and personal reasons. Monday morning brought a phone call that completely transformed the Morrison manufacturing situation. Marcus Thompson personally called me at Phoenix Capital Group, his voice warm and professional, as he expressed his desire to work with me directly on strategic consulting projects. Thompson explained that he had been following my career and reputation in the consulting industry for several months before approaching Hartwell. His research had convinced him that my unique combination of legal expertise and business acumen made me the ideal consultant for Morrison's complex merger and acquisition activities. He revealed that Morrison Manufacturing had been impressed not just with my track record of successful deals, but also with my reputation for integrity and professional consistency. Several of his industry contacts had recommended me specifically describing my approach as thorough, reliable, and results-oriented. Thompson offered me a consulting contract worth more than my entire annual Hartwell salary for just the current project, with the possibility of additional retainer agreements for future strategic initiatives. This offer represented not just financial opportunity, but also professional validation from one of the most respected executives in the manufacturing sector. During our conversation, Thompson shared his frustrations with Hartwell's handling of the consulting team changes. He described feeling blindsided by the sudden replacement of his specifically requested consultant with someone who clearly didn't understand manufacturing industry dynamics or Morrison's business culture. Thompson's assessment of Brad Coleman was diplomatically harsh. He characterized Brad's approach as completely inappropriate for traditional manufacturing negotiations, comparing it to trying to sell ice cream to Eskimos. The disconnect between Brad's Silicon Valley methods and Morrison's operational reality had been immediately obvious and professionally insulting. I consulted with my attorney about the legal implications of working directly with Morrison Manufacturing, while Sandra's defamatory email remained unaddressed. My lawyer confirmed that I had strong grounds for a defamation lawsuit against both Sandra personally and Hartwell corporately, given the documented false statements about my professional conduct. The legal analysis revealed that Sandra's email had created significant exposure for Hartwell, as companies can be held liable for defamatory statements made by their executives in their professional capacity. The email's distribution to the entire executive team demonstrated clear intent to damage my reputation within the business community. Meanwhile, the situation at Hartwell continued deteriorating rapidly. Richard Hartwell had fired Brad Coleman after discovering the fabricated progress reports, but this action only highlighted the poor judgment that had created the crisis in the first place. The board of directors initiated a formal investigation into Sandra's decision-making process and her handling of client relationships. Multiple clients began questioning Hartwell's consulting capabilities as word spread through industry networks about the Morrison debacle. The company's reputation for reliable professional service was being damaged by the perception that they made arbitrary personnel changes without considering client preferences or project continuity. Amy Chen provided regular updates about the internal chaos at Hartwell. Sandra's behavior had become increasingly erratic as she struggled to manage the cascading consequences of her decisions. She was alternating between desperate attempts to fix the Morrison relationship and angry blame-shifting exercises that accomplished nothing positive. Tom Rodriguez reached out privately to express his regret about the entire situation and to explore whether there might be any way to salvage Hartwell's relationship with Morrison Manufacturing. His concern was primarily financial, as the potential lawsuit and lost business could seriously impact the company's stability and growth prospects. I began developing a strategic response that could potentially benefit everyone involved, except Sandra herself. Working with Phoenix Capital Group, I proposed a three-way arrangement where I would consult for Morrison through my new firm with Hartwell, providing limited administrative support to maintain their contractual relationship. This arrangement would allow Morrison to work with their preferred consultant, while giving Hartwell a face-saving way to maintain some involvement in the project. Phoenix Capital Group would gain a prestigious client, and I would have the opportunity to complete the work I had started months earlier. Rachel Murphy from Morrison Manufacturing became my primary contact for developing this collaborative approach. She appreciated the diplomatic solution that addressed Thompson's preference for working with me while avoiding the complete humiliation of Hartwell's consulting division. The investigation into Sandra's conduct revealed a pattern of similar poor decisions with other clients over the previous 18 months. Board members discovered that she had made several arbitrary consultant reassignments that had damaged client relationships, though none as dramatically as the Morrison situation. The internal investigation also revealed that Sandra's decision to hire Brad Coleman had been influenced by personal factors rather than professional qualifications. Brad's previous work had been primarily with small tech startups, making him completely inappropriate for large-scale manufacturing negotiations. Amy Chen made the decision to leave Hartwell and join Phoenix Capital Group as my junior partner in the new consulting division. Her departure was another blow to Hartwell's consulting capabilities and represented a significant brain drain from their already depleted team. The Morrison Manufacturing deal moved forward successfully under my guidance with terms that were actually more favorable than the original proposal. Thompson was impressed with the collaborative approach and began discussing additional consulting opportunities for future strategic initiatives. Sandra's position became completely untenable as the board of directors concluded their investigation. She was terminated for cause losing her severance package and facing potential personal liability for the defamation claims. Her termination was announced internally as a restructuring decision, but everyone understood the real reasons behind her departure. Richard Hartwell personally called me to apologize for Sandra's behavior and to request that I consider not pursuing legal action against the company. He offered a partnership position in Hartwell's restructured consulting division, but I politely declined, explaining that my future was with Phoenix Capital Group. The call from Richard was significant because it represented official acknowledgement that Sandra's decisions had been wrong and damaging to the company. His willingness to personally apologize and make amends demonstrated the seriousness of the situation from Hartwell's perspective. As I prepared for my final negotiation session with Morrison Manufacturing, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed from Sandra's initial dismissal. Her attempt to demonstrate authority and bring in fresh talent had instead exposed her poor judgment and damaged her own career irreparably. The Morrison deal's successful completion would establish Phoenix Capital Group as a serious player in the strategic consulting market, while cementing my reputation as an expert in complex manufacturing negotiations. What had started as a professional setback had become a launching pad for greater opportunities and recognition. 6 months later, I sat in my spacious corner office at Phoenix Capital Group, fielding calls from both Morrison Manufacturing and Hartwell Industries. The contrast between my current situation and Sandra's desperate apartment visit was remarkable and satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. The Morrison Manufacturing merger had closed successfully with terms so favorable that Marcus Thompson had become one of my strongest professional advocates. He regularly recommended my consulting services to other manufacturing executives, describing my approach as the gold standard for complex business negotiations. Thompson's endorsement had opened doors throughout the manufacturing sector. 5 Fortune 500 companies had approached Phoenix Capital Group specifically requesting my involvement in their strategic planning and merger activities. My client list had grown to include household name brands in automotive, aerospace, and industrial equipment sectors. The three-way arrangement I had proposed for the Morrison deal had worked perfectly for everyone except Sandra. Morrison got their preferred consultant Hartwell salvaged some involvement and avoided complete humiliation, and Phoenix Capital Group gained credibility and connections in the manufacturing sector. Tom Rodriguez had been promoted to Sandra's former position as Vice President of Strategic Consulting, and his first major decision was to rebuild the relationship with my practice. He understood that maintaining professional connections was crucial for Hartwell's long-term success, regardless of past conflicts. Under Tom's leadership, Hartwell began referring clients to Phoenix Capital Group for specialized manufacturing consultations, creating a collaborative relationship that benefited both firms. This arrangement demonstrated how professional relationships could survive organizational changes when handled with mutual respect and competence. Amy Chen had flourished as my junior partner at Phoenix Capital Group, developing her own expertise in technology sector negotiations while learning advanced manufacturing consulting techniques. Her decision to leave Hartwell had proven beneficial for her career development and earning potential. The professional transformation was gratifying, but the personal growth had been equally important. Sandra's dismissive treatment had initially stung, but it had ultimately freed me from a toxic environment that was limiting my potential and damaging my professional satisfaction. My annual income had tripled compared to my Hartwell salary, but the financial improvement was less significant than the restoration of professional respect and autonomy. Phoenix Capital Group valued my expertise and gave me complete freedom to develop consulting methodologies without arbitrary interference. Industry recognition followed the successful outcomes. The American Strategic Business Association named me Consultant of the Year, highlighting my innovative approach to combining legal analysis with psychological profiling in business negotiations. Several business journals featured articles about my methods and their application to complex corporate deals. The Morrison case study became a teaching tool at 3 major universities, demonstrating how understanding client psychology and industry culture could make the difference between successful and failed negotiations. Guest lecturing opportunities allowed me to share insights with the next generation of business consultants. Sandra's defamation lawsuit had been settled out of court with terms that included a public apology and substantial financial compensation. The settlement also included non-disclosure provisions, but the professional community understood the basic facts about her misconduct and poor judgment. Sandra's career in consulting had effectively ended with her termination from Hartwell. Word of her behavior had spread through professional networks, making it difficult for her to find comparable positions at other firms. Her attempt to blame me for the Morrison debacle had backfired, completely damaging her reputation while elevating mine. Brad Coleman's consulting career had also suffered significant damage from the Morrison failure. His methods might have worked well in Silicon Valley startup environments, but his complete misunderstanding of traditional business culture had become a cautionary tale in consulting circles. The psychological aspects of the entire situation were fascinating from a professional perspective. Sandra's need to demonstrate authority and control had led her to make decisions based on appearance rather than substance. Her preference for flashy innovation over proven competence had created exactly the kind of instability that sophisticated clients avoid. Marcus Thompson's reaction had been entirely predictable given his background and business philosophy. Manufacturing executives like Thompson built their success on reliability, consistency, and proven performance. Sandra's arbitrary consultant changes had violated all of those principles simultaneously. The legal implications had been more serious than Sandra initially understood. Her defamatory email had created corporate liability that extended beyond simple employment disputes. Hartwell's insurance company had been forced to cover significant legal costs and settlement payments related to her misconduct. Richard Hartwell's personal intervention had been crucial for limiting the damage to his company's reputation. His willingness to acknowledge mistakes and make amends had preserved some relationships that might otherwise have been permanently damaged by Sandra's behavior. The broader lesson was about the importance of understanding client relationships and industry dynamics when making personnel decisions. Sandra's focus on internal politics and personal preferences had blinded her to the external consequences of her choices. Phoenix Capital Group's growth had been accelerated by the credibility gained from the Morrison success. Other investment firms were now approaching us for strategic consulting support, recognizing that our manufacturing sector expertise filled a gap in their service offerings. My consulting practice had evolved beyond individual deals to include ongoing strategic advisory relationships with major corporations. These retainer arrangements provided steady income while allowing me to develop deep understanding of client industries and business cultures. The Morrison manufacturing relationship had expanded to include quarterly strategic planning sessions and annual competitive analysis projects. Thompson valued having access to experienced consulting support without the overhead and complexity of maintaining internal strategic planning departments. Amy's development as a consultant had exceeded my expectations, and she was now handling her own client accounts with minimal supervision. Her success demonstrated the value of mentorship and collaborative learning environments compared to the competitive dysfunction that had characterized Sandra's leadership style. The transformation from Sandra's public humiliation to industry recognition had taken less than 12 months, demonstrating how quickly professional fortunes can change when competence and integrity are consistently applied to challenging situations. As I prepared for my next major client presentation, I reflected on how Sandra's attempt to make me feel dispensable had actually revealed my true market value and opened opportunities I might never have discovered otherwise. 2 years after Sandra Walsh dismissed me as dispensable, I was standing at the podium of the Hilton Chicago receiving the Strategic Consulting Excellence Award from the National Association of Business Advisors. The irony wasn't lost on me that this recognition came directly from the expertise Sandra had deemed outdated and irrelevant. Phoenix Capital Group had become one of the most respected strategic consulting firms in the Midwest, with annual revenues exceeding $12 million. My practice had grown to include 15 Fortune 500 clients, and we maintained waiting lists for new consulting engagements. The demand for our services validated everything I had believed about the value of combining legal expertise with psychological insight in business negotiations. The Morrison manufacturing case study was now taught at Harvard Business School, Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Wharton as an example of how understanding client psychology and industry culture drive successful negotiations. Students analyzed how my approach differed from Brad Coleman's methods and why those differences had produced such dramatically different outcomes. Marcus Thompson had become more than a client. He was now a trusted advisor who helped me understand manufacturing industry trends and connected me with other executives seeking strategic consulting support. Our professional relationship had evolved into the kind of long-term partnership that creates value for both parties over many years. Sandra's career had never recovered from the Morrison debacle and subsequent legal issues. Industry sources indicated she had left consulting entirely and was working in a completely different field. Her attempt to destroy my reputation had instead highlighted her own poor judgment and unprofessional conduct, creating a cautionary tale that was still discussed in business schools and professional development seminars. The financial transformation was remarkable, but not the most important aspect of my success. My current annual income was nearly 5 times what I had earned at Hartwell, but the professional respect and autonomy were far more valuable than the monetary compensation. Phoenix Capital Group treated me as a true partner rather than an employee, giving me complete freedom to develop consulting methodologies and select clients. Amy Chen had emerged as one of the most promising young consultants in the industry, successfully completing major negotiations for technology companies while learning manufacturing sector expertise under my guidance. Her success demonstrated the value of supportive mentorship compared to the toxic competitive environment Sandra had created at Hartwell. Tom Rodriguez had successfully rebuilt Hartwell's consulting division after Sandra's departure, focusing on collaborative relationships and client service, rather than internal politics. He regularly referred clients to Phoenix Capital Group for specialized expertise, creating a professional network that benefited both firms and their clients. Richard Hartwell had implemented new governance procedures to prevent future personnel decisions from being made without proper client consultation and risk assessment. The Morrison crisis had taught his company valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining stable client relationships and respecting customer preferences. The legal resolution of Sandra's defamation had included not just financial compensation, but also professional vindication through her written acknowledgement that her statements about my conduct had been false and damaging. This outcome had cleared my reputation completely while establishing legal precedent for holding executives accountable for malicious statements about former employees. My consulting methodology had been refined and systematized into a comprehensive approach that other consultants were now studying and adapting. The combination of legal analysis, psychological profiling, and industry expertise had proven effective across multiple sectors and deal types. Guest lecturing opportunities at major universities allowed me to share insights with students who would become the next generation of business leaders. These sessions often focused on the importance of integrity competence and client service over political positioning and superficial innovation. The personal growth that resulted from Sandra's dismissal had been as significant as the professional advancement. Being called dispensable had forced me to examine my true value and develop the confidence to demand appropriate recognition and compensation for my expertise. Professional relationships throughout the consulting industry had been strengthened by my handling of the crisis with dignity and competence. Colleagues who had witnessed Sandra's behavior understood that my success was based on merit rather than politics, creating a foundation of respect that enhanced my reputation and opened new opportunities. The Morrison manufacturing merger had ultimately saved both companies over $40 million compared to their original projections, demonstrating the tangible value of experienced strategic consulting. This financial outcome provided concrete evidence of my consulting effectiveness that no amount of political maneuvering could have achieved. Industry publications regularly featured articles about my consulting approach and its application to complex business challenges. These publications helped establish Phoenix Capital Group's thought leadership position while educating other consultants about effective negotiation strategies. Speaking engagements at professional conferences allowed me to share lessons learned from the Morrison experience and other successful consulting projects. These presentations often emphasize the importance of understanding client culture and psychology rather than relying on generic methodologies. The transformation from Sandra's public humiliation to industry recognition had taught me that professional setbacks often reveal opportunities that might otherwise remain hidden. Being forced out of a comfortable but limiting situation had pushed me to discover my true potential and market value. Amy frequently mentioned that watching my response to Sandra's treatment had influenced her own approach to professional challenges. She learned that maintaining dignity and competence under pressure creates more opportunities than responding with anger or defensiveness. The consulting practice I had built at Phoenix Capital Group was now training ground for other experienced professionals seeking to develop specialized expertise in manufacturing sector negotiations. This mentorship role provided personal satisfaction while expanding the firm's capabilities and reputation. Marcus Thompson's continued advocacy had led to consulting relationships with his industry contacts, creating a network effect that generated new business opportunities through referrals and recommendations. This organic growth demonstrated the long-term value of building genuine professional relationships based on mutual respect and delivered results. The lesson that emerged most clearly from the entire experience was that true professional value comes from competence, integrity, and the courage to walk away from situations where those qualities aren't recognized or respected. Sandra's attempt to make me feel disposable had actually revealed that the right opportunities were waiting for someone with my skills and experience. My story had become a source of inspiration for other professionals facing similar workplace challenges. The message was simple but powerful. Your expertise and reputation belong to you, and no one else can take them away or diminish their value in the marketplace. The happy ending wasn't just about financial success or industry recognition, though those outcomes were gratifying. The real victory was discovering that being dismissed from the wrong opportunity had led directly to finding the right one where my contributions were valued and my potential could be fully realized. As I concluded my acceptance speech that evening in Chicago, I reflected on how Sandra's decision to replace me had been the best thing that could have happened to my career. Sometimes being told you're dispensable is exactly the push you need to discover you're actually invaluable. What workplace challenge have you faced that initially seemed devastating but ultimately led to better opportunities? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let me know, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming professional setbacks and finding success on your own terms. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their value isn't determined by others' recognition of it. Thank you so much for listening, and remember your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. Here's to finding the courage to walk toward opportunities that truly appreciate what you bring to the table.